Hello again. When you look inside the very core of your decision-making self, what do you see? A horse and cart, an elephant, or the God seed? For this reflection and the next one, I'm grateful to the writings of Jonathan Haidt and Margaret Silf, and you can find references to their work at the end of next week's video. We've been thinking in the last couple of weeks about how free we are to make our rational choices. Now, there is a school of thought which says that we're not free at all to make rational choices. Our choices are determined by hidden forces beyond our control. Free will is an illusion. Does the fact I disagree with that view come down to the influence of forces beyond my control? Well, if so, I'll never know either way. It's one of those philosophical conundrums that's impossible to resolve. But since on a practical level we live our lives as if we do have rational choices, and we treat other people as if they do too, then for the sake of argument I'll assume that I do have the freedom to make rational, conscious choices of my own. Throughout history, various ideas have been put forward to explain why we can't always seem to make, with as much ease as we would like, the choices that we'd want to. Let's think about Plato. Plato saw the decision-making self like a two-horse chariot. One horse, whose motivations were regarded by Plato as noble and praiseworthy, could easily be controlled by a simple word. The other horse is liable to pull the driver off course, since it's motivated by appetites and lusts. That horse is, in Plato's words, deaf as a post, and needs to be controlled by the reins, since speaking to it's a waste of time. The goal of the rider, your decision-making self, is to keep the two horses under control. Sigmund Freud had an updated version of this model. For Freud, the mind is divided into three parts. First we have the ego, which is the conscious, rational self. Then we have the superego, which we might call the conscience. This reveals itself in a fairly rigid commitment to rules and norms. Finally, we have the id, which desires pleasure, wants as much pleasure as it can get, and wants it now. Jonathan Haidt explains Freud's view with this metaphor. The mind is a horse and buggy in which the driver, the ego, struggles to control the lustful, hungry horse, the id, whilst the driver's father, the superego, sits in the back lecturing the driver on what he's doing wrong. On this model, what's making you unfree is both the lustful horse and the censorious father figure. You would really like the one just to do what you tell it, and the other just to keep its opinions to itself. Another way of thinking about how the mind works is to think of its various actions as either controlled or automatic. Sometimes we seem to act in ways over which we have no control. We get a gut feeling about someone or interpret the way they look at us in a particular way. On that basis, we then decide we know what they're thinking, even though we don't and have no objective evidence to tell us, and we make decisions about that person accordingly. Or to give another example, there are fascinating experiments in which a group of people, seated at the same table, were asked to fill in a questionnaire. Some filled in a questionnaire asking about what they thought it felt like to be old, whilst others were asked about feeling young. At the end of the exercise, when they all got up to go, the people who filled in the questions about feeling old walked more slowly than the ones who'd been thinking about being young. There would seem to be enough evidence to suggest that our minds have processes which are controlled and others which are more automatic. Jonathan Haidt, again, describes this using the image of riding an elephant. The rider is our conscious reasoning self with its beliefs and decision-making power. It has the advantages of the best position to see the way ahead and can direct the elephant with the reins if he wants it to change direction. The elephant is everything else that goes on within us that isn't conscious reasoning thought. Gut feelings, visceral reactions, intuitions, unconscious biases, and emotions. And if the elephant ever decides to go somewhere on its own, well, then the rider just has to go with it. The limits of your freedom are to hold on and go with the ride. We could think in terms of the rider and the elephant both having their own intelligences. And what we want is for them to work together. How then can we help this to happen? One way is to train the elephant. Whilst in any given moment the elephant may be leading the way, there are steps we can take to train it to go in the direction we would like it to. The mental reframing exercise in our last reflection is one of those ways. When we change our default thoughts from, for example, I have to, into I get the chance to, it's like feeding our inner elephant a peanut. It feels more inclined to follow the lead of our inner rider rather than putting up resistance. Using this model can be useful as we explore our own decision-making moments. As you review these moments, what are the influences that were making you more free than unfree? Were you responding to gut feelings, intuitions, or unconscious biases? Conclusions based on no evidence at all? Are these indications that your elephant needs some training? Let me give you a hypothetical example. Today I met Eddie, who asked me to sponsor him for a charity swim. I found myself getting annoyed with him for asking and decided I wouldn't like his charity. Eddie is a friend who I see regularly and I know he supports this particular charity. There is no good reason why I should be surprised, let alone annoyed, that at some point he would ask me to help him fundraise. So what's going on? On further reflection, I realise that my reaction has nothing to do with Eddie. Earlier in the same day, I've received a message, an email from an ex-colleague, Brendan. I've had no contact with Brendan for 4 years. Out of the blue, he emails me, not with an inquiry about my welfare or asking if we could catch up, but to ask me to donate to his new charitable venture. I find this both irritating and disappointing. Is this all I am to you, Brendan? A commodity to be tapped into when useful and forgotten about otherwise? Well, as I'm thinking about this, I realise my elephant needs some retraining. When it gets annoyed with someone, it needs to be trained to keep that annoyance focused on its direct cause and not directed towards other people. Better still, I could train my elephant to respond to annoyance with the calming equilibrium that comes from an inclination towards forgiveness, rather than looking for someone to trample on. I'm sure by now you're getting the picture. Whether you prefer to use the model of gaining more control of your automatic mental processes or the metaphor of building up a better relationship between your rider and your elephant, you now have another approach for thinking through what might be causing you to be free or unfree, and better to know yourself. But what about the fourth image I mentioned, the God seed? Well, coming to that, as we will next week, will bring us back around again to where we started, to the wisdom and insights of Ignatius of Loyola. But until then, thanks for listening. Have a good week.